Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's been whispered, censored, worshipped, and misunderstood for nearly 2,000 years. A story about the world before the Kama Sutra. Before it became a scandal, before it became a book, before it became a symbol of anything at all. This is the world that birthed it, a place where desire wasn't shameful, where love was philosophy, and where even pleasure was seen as a path toward the divine. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy falling down strange, ancient rabbit holes like this one. Drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from, or if your idea of romance involves philosophy, incense, and possibly reincarnation. Now dim the lights, breathe deep, and settle in. Tonight, we go back to when the world was slower, softer, and sacred in ways we've almost forgotten. Before the Kama Sutra was ever inked onto palm leaves, before Vatsyayana ever picked up a pen, India was already obsessed, not with sex, but with balance. It was a civilization where everything from the flight of birds to the beating of your heart was part of a cosmic rhythm called Artha, the order of things. You didn't just exist, you participated. Every breath, every act, every desire was a note in an eternal song that connected you to the universe. And this rhythm had rules, not the kind written down in law, but the kind that lived in stories. The gods themselves embodied this balance. Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer. Each one essential, each one incomplete without the others. Creation was not a clean process. It pulsed with contradiction, birth and death, duty and pleasure, chaos and stillness. In this world, passion wasn't something to be hidden, it was something to be understood. The earliest Indian texts, the Vedas and later the Upanishads, spoke about life as having multiple aims. You weren't supposed to choose between being good, being successful, or being happy. You were meant to balance them all, Dharma for virtue, Artha for prosperity, Kama for pleasure. The great experiment of Indian thought wasn't about denial, it was about harmony. So when the Kama Sutra eventually appeared, it wasn't a rebellion against morality, it was its completion. It belonged to a lineage that believed the body was not a cage, but a vessel, capable of joy, tenderness, and transcendence. The world it came from didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. They were two sides of the same coin, both shimmering with meaning. Imagine ancient cities like Pataliputra or Ujjain, the hum of markets filled with spices, silk, and gossip. Brahmins reciting mantras under banyan trees, merchants haggling in Sanskrit and Prakrit, courtesans performing poetry to candlelight. It was a world alive with texture, the scent of sandalwood in the air, the clink of bronze lamps, the slow heat of an Indian evening. Desire wasn't scandalous here, it was simply another current flowing through daily life. Marriage, too, was seen differently. It wasn't just an arrangement of property or lineage, though it was those things too. It was a ritual of balance between duty and delight. There were rules for affection, for companionship, even for conversation. Poetry and music were not luxuries, but necessities, the language of an educated soul. To know beauty was to know truth. In this tapestry, Kama wasn't just physical longing, it was the art of living beautifully. It meant taste, appreciation, connection. It meant the pleasure of music, the joy of color, the sweetness of conversation. Even the gods indulged. Krishna danced with the gopis, Shiva united with Parvati, and every myth seemed to remind mortals that ecstasy was not sin, but energy, divine and dangerous all at once. To the people of ancient India, desire was a mirror. It could show you your soul or consume it entirely. That's why it needed to be studied, guided, and understood. You didn't deny pleasure, you mastered it. Like fire, it could cook or destroy depending on how you handled it. And this attitude wasn't unique to one class or caste. The scholars studied philosophy, the courtesans studied poetry, and kings studied both. The Kama Sutra would later describe courtesans as some of the most educated people in society, fluent in conversation, strategy, music, and wit. They weren't objects, they were artists. Love, in all its forms, was seen as performance, ritual, and philosophy rolled into one. Religion, too, was less about commandments and more about connection. The temples themselves were sensual, carved with dancers, gods, and lovers, frozen in eternal motion. To walk through the temple corridors was to walk through the cycle of life itself. From birth to union, to death, to rebirth. Nothing was hidden because nothing was shameful, but the world wasn't all incense and poetry. There were also rules, rigid social hierarchies, arranged marriages, and moral expectations that shaped daily life. Yet even within these boundaries, people found ways to express longing and affection. Letters were exchanged in secret, songs whispered between curtains, gestures loaded with meaning. Love existed not in defiance of society, but within its cracks, blooming quietly where it could. This was the paradox of ancient India, a civilization both conservative and deeply sensual. A world that believed in restraint but also in indulgence, just not without purpose. Desire, like meditation or devotion, was another way of reaching self-knowledge. And beneath all this, the rituals, the festivals, the poetry, there was always philosophy. Every act was a question. What is the self? What is connection? What does it mean to live fully? The Kama Sutra would later answer these not with dogma but with observation, that to understand love was to understand human nature itself. The stage was set, a civilization in full bloom, confident in its art, its gods, and its humanity. A world unafraid of passion because it trusted its own balance. Out of this soil, fragrant with poetry, bound by ritual and alive with questions, something remarkable would soon be written. Not a manual, not a scandal, but a mirror. A philosophy disguised as a whisper. A map for those who dared to live not just well, but beautifully. And somewhere, in that dim light of ancient India, between a philosopher's scroll and a courtesan's song, a thinker named Vatsyayana was about to gather everything this world believed about love, duty, and desire, and turn it into something eternal. He lived in an age when India shimmered with temples, poems, and philosophies, a civilization already old when Rome was young. Somewhere between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, amid the hum of trade and the hush of monasteries, a man named Vatsyayana Malanaga began to write. We know almost nothing certain about him, no birthplace, no disciples, no grand statue in his honor. What we have instead is his voice, threaded through his sentences, calm, observant, and quietly radical. He called his work the Kama Sutra. Sutra meaning thread, Kama meaning desire. But Vatsyayana did not write a book of indulgence. He wrote a philosophy of living, one where pleasure had meaning, and meaning had rhythm. In his own preface, he tells us he was a celibate monk, a brahmachari. It's an image that startles modern readers, a man who renounced pleasure writing the most famous treatise about it. But that paradox is exactly what makes him fascinating. To him, understanding desire was not about surrendering to it, it was about studying it, like a philosopher studies truth. He wasn't the first to write about love. Before him came Nandi, Shvetaketu, and other thinkers of older ages, sages who saw human relationships as a mirror of the cosmic dance between Shiva and Shakti, male and female, energy, and stillness. Vatsyayana didn't invent the conversation, he systematized it. He gathered wisdom from poets, courtesans, ascetics, and lovers, weaving them into a single, coherent philosophy, one that saw pleasure as a discipline rather than a sin. To understand him, you must picture his India. Cities like Pataliputra and Ujjain glowed with trade and learning. The Silk Road pulsed with movement. Merchants from Rome, Persia, and China brushing past Indian scholars and dancers in crowded markets. Temples echoed with chants, public gardens with laughter. Art flourished, sandstone figures carved in sensual postures, not to provoke, but to celebrate life itself. This was not a prudish world. In sculpture and scripture alike, love was sacred. The divine couple, Shiva and Parvati, were not just cosmic symbols, but emotional beings, arguing, teasing, reconciling. The gods themselves were sensual and yet deeply spiritual. The same breath that recited the Vedas could sing a love poem. Into this world stepped Vatsyayana, quill in hand. He watched how people loved, the courtesans who were trained in conversation and poetry, the young brides whose lives were arranged like political treaties, the men who sought pleasure, and the women who wielded power through grace. He observed, analyzed, and distilled it all into principles, calm, exacting, sometimes coldly pragmatic. For Vatsyayana, love was a science. He divided human pursuit into three pillars: Dharma, which meant duty, righteousness; Artha, which meant wealth, material well-being; Kama, which meant pleasure, love, and desire. To live well, one must balance all three. Neglect anyone, and life collapses into chaos. The ascetic who denies pleasure is incomplete. The hedonist who forgets duty is lost. Balance, that was his gospel. Yet what he called karma wasn't simply lust. It was the art of being fully alive, of eating, speaking, dressing, and loving with awareness. He taught that beauty was not luxury, but expression of harmony. To walk, to converse, to touch. These were all forms of artistry. His writing tone is almost clinical at times, more like an anthropologist than a poet. He describes acts and techniques without shame or flourish, as though he were describing how to play an instrument or paint a picture. It's methodical, intellectual, and deeply human. But beneath his calm prose, something warmer moves, a conviction that love matters, that it's not trivial or base, but essential to human existence. He also wrote during a time of transformation. Buddhism and Jainism had already spread ideas of renunciation, urging people to detach from desire. The spiritual elite leaned toward restraint. Against that backdrop, the Kama Sutra was almost rebellious, not because it defied morality, but because it refused to separate pleasure from morality. To Vatsyayana, suppression was ignorance, understanding was wisdom. He argued that desire, when guided by knowledge, could lead to a refined life. Love, after all, was not a distraction from the path. It was part of it. Pleasure could be practiced with mindfulness, much like meditation. A lover, like a sage, could cultivate awareness. And yet, his sutras were not just for monks or philosophers. They were for everyone, the householder, the wife, the courtesan, the merchant. He saw women not as passive subjects, but as equal participants in the art of love. In his pages, women choose, test, and teach. He catalogues their voices, what they desire, how they charm, and how they sustain their independence in a world built by men. It's a remarkably modern text in that sense, one that, in its own way, argues for emotional intelligence, mutual consent, and personal fulfillment. Some scholars believe Vatsyayana wrote his treatise in the quiet of Pataliputra, the imperial capital, perhaps within the hush of a monastery. Others imagine him as a recluse near the Ganges, surrounded by scrolls and incense. Wherever he lived, he was certainly aware of both worlds, the spiritual and the sensual, and sought to reconcile them. His language is Sanskrit, precise and elegant. The sutras themselves are short, like threads meant to be remembered, recited, and expanded upon by teachers and students. They were never meant to be read like a novel. They were studied, debated, transmitted, a manual not just of pleasure, but of civilization itself. He quotes poets and dramatists, cites earlier treatises, and even refers to Kama Sutras that predate him, now lost to time. He was not an inventor of eroticism. He was its archivist, philosopher, and reformer. And perhaps that's why his voice still resonates. In a world obsessed with extremes, purity or indulgence, abstinence or excess, Vatsyayana offered a third way, understanding. He never preaches indulgence, nor does he condemn it. His tone is that of an observer who has seen life in all its forms and simply wishes to record it faithfully. There's dignity in that neutrality, the dignity of one who understands that morality without empathy is hollow, and pleasure without awareness is chaos. For him, karma was not dirty, ignorance was, and in that subtle distinction lies the soul of his philosophy. When he finished writing, Vatsyayana left behind not just a manual, but a mirror, one that reflected his world's deepest contradictions. Its spiritual wisdom, its sensual art, its class hierarchies, and its human longing to be seen, touched, understood. He may have vanished into obscurity after writing it, but the text endured, whispered in royal courts, copied by scholars, and centuries later rediscovered by the West, where it would be sensationalized and misunderstood. But long before it became a symbol of erotic curiosity, it was a meditation on life itself, on what it means to love, to long, and to live consciously. And through that mirror of philosophy and flesh, we now step into the heart of his creation, into what the Kama Sutra truly is. For centuries, the Kama Sutra has carried a reputation it never asked for. In the Western imagination, it became a whispered word, something scandalous, hidden behind curtains or sold in glossy covers, promising exotic secrets. But that version is a mirage. The Kama Sutra is not a sex manual. It is a social philosophy, a study of human behavior, wrapped in poetry, precision, and grace. To open its pages with curiosity and not judgment is to find not instructions for lust, but guidelines for living beautifully. The text begins not with bodies, but with principles, a map of how life should be lived. It speaks of character, conversation, manners, relationships, and the fine art of attraction. It describes how a person might carry themselves in the world, how to walk, dress, and speak, how to choose a partner, maintain a household, and cultivate joy. It's a book of aesthetics and ethics, not indulgence. Vatsyayana divides his masterpiece into 7 books, each exploring a different layer of human experience. Together, they form a portrait not of pleasure alone, but of civilization. The first book lays the foundation, defining what karma is and how it fits into the greater human purpose. Vatsyayana explains that pleasure, wealth, and virtue are not opposites, but parts of a whole, that a meaningful life must hold all 3 in balance. He warns that those who pursue pleasure without wisdom will suffer, those who reject it entirely will wither. It's a moral philosophy disguised as simplicity. The second book moves into the art of attraction. It's here that the famous descriptions of intimacy appear, but even these are not what they seem. The acts themselves are not the point. Awareness is. He writes about mood, setting, respect, and consent, long before the modern world even had a word for it. The lovers in his verses are equals in the dance, each attuned to the other's rhythm, each learning how to give and receive. The third and fourth books are social handbooks. They explore marriage, courtship, and companionship, how people meet, how love grows and sometimes fades, how families are built and sustained. He writes of timing, that love, like seasons, has its moments. He observes human nature without judgment, the excitement of early love, the comfort of routine, the quiet ache of betrayal. The fifth book turns its gaze toward the courtesans, the most educated, eloquent, and self-possessed women of ancient India. In Vatsyayana's time, they were artists of life itself, trained in music, conversation, poetry, and philosophy. They were not merely entertainers, but women of intellect and independence. Vatsyayana respects them as students of Kama in its purest form, not because they sold pleasure, but because they understood the psychology of it. He devotes chapters to how a courtesan should live, choose lovers, and guard her dignity. His advice to them is sharp, worldly, and surprisingly feminist. He tells them not to serve unworthy men, to keep their wealth secure, and to never confuse affection with servitude. It's a manual of autonomy disguised as etiquette. The sixth book is about enchantment, perfumes, music, games, gardens, art. Here the Kama Sutra becomes a study of refinement, how to make a home inviting, how to engage the senses without excess, how beauty, when balanced, becomes a form of virtue. And the final book addresses the politics of love, rivalries, jealousies, and the delicate dance of power between men and women. It's frank and unapologetic about human flaws. It doesn't pretend that love is pure, it shows it as it is, messy, fragile, and endlessly complex. Taken together, these books create something extraordinary, a social encyclopedia. The Kama Sutra was not meant to be read in secret. It was studied, recited, debated. It wasn't hidden under pillows. It was discussed in royal courts and scholarly gatherings. Kings consulted it to understand courtly behavior. Poets drew from it to refine their verses. Householders used it as a guide to harmony. And nowhere in its pages does it preach excess. Vatsyayana warns repeatedly against obsession, against neglecting one's duties or harming others in the pursuit of desire. The text's true message is balance, that pleasure is sacred only when it coexists with wisdom, generosity, and awareness. He reminds readers that karma cannot thrive in isolation. A life spent chasing desire without virtue or prosperity is like a chariot missing its wheels. Pleasure alone cannot sustain a soul. It needs roots. This sense of proportion is what makes the Kama Sutra timeless. It isn't about how to love, it's about how to live. Modern readers often forget how revolutionary this was. In a world where many ancient cultures condemn desire as sinful or distracting, India embraced it as part of the cosmic design. Desire was not to be shamed, but understood. The Kama Sutra turned that understanding into an art form, and that art form touched every aspect of life. Vatsyayana wrote of how lovers should exchange letters, how they should decorate their homes, how they should speak in public and private. He describes the power of scent, sandalwood, saffron, jasmine, and how smell can stir memory. He writes about timing, that morning is for study, afternoon for work, and twilight for pleasure. He even details how a home should be arranged, with flowers, music, and conversation that invites ease. It's a guide to harmony between self and world, body and mind, individual and society. The Kama Sutra recognizes that love is not isolated from class, wealth, or duty. It describes the roles of men and women, the hierarchies of households, the moral expectations of marriage. It reflects its own time, a patriarchal society, yet within those constraints, it offers surprising nuance. Vatsyayana gives women agency within the system. He teaches men to treat them with respect and curiosity, not as property, but as partners. He condemns cruelty, mocks vanity, and celebrates mutual joy. In his world, desire becomes a dialogue, not domination. There's also a profound spirituality beneath it all, subtle but unmistakable. The Kama Sutra is not religious, yet it breathes the same air as India's spiritual texts. It sees Kama as one of the four aims of life, along with Dharma, virtue, Artha, prosperity, and Moksha, liberation. In other words, pleasure is part of the sacred order of existence. This isn't indulgence, it's integration. Every touch, every glance, every word between lovers can be an act of awareness, a meditation on connection. To live beautifully is to live consciously, and that is the true heart of the Kama Sutra. It's why the text devotes just as much attention to how to smile as it does to how to kiss. To Vatsyayana, grace is not decoration, it's the foundation of humanity. The way we move, speak, and love reveals the quality of our soul. And in this way, the Kama Sutra becomes not a book about the body, but a philosophy of being, one that treats pleasure as poetry and daily life as art. When stripped of its sensationalism, what remains is a rare document of human dignity, one that teaches not just how to seek happiness, but how to deserve it. Because to Vatsyayana, karma was never just about pleasure. It was about refinement, discipline, empathy, and the pursuit of harmony. And through this lens of balance between desire and duty, the Kama Sutra takes its rightful place in India's ancient trilogy of purpose, virtue, prosperity, and desire. The three strands that together wove the philosophy of life itself. Before there was the Kama Sutra, there was balance. Ancient India didn't build its philosophy on commandments or confessions. It built it on harmony. It wasn't a battle between body and soul. It was a dance between three great purposes, known as Purusharthas: Dharma, virtue; Artha, prosperity; and Kama, desire. Together they formed a map for living. Not just for saints and kings, but for everyone who wanted to live well and meaningfully. Every text, every story, every moral in classical India circled back to these three words. And if you could hold them in balance, you weren't just surviving, you were fulfilling the very purpose of existence. Dharma, the spine of the universe, the first pillar, Dharma, was the law of harmony. Not law in the legal sense, but in the moral one, the invisible thread that kept the world from unraveling. It was duty, yes, but not blind obedience. It was the understanding that every action has weight, and that to live rightly is to move in rhythm with the world around you. For a king, Dharma meant ruling with justice. For a merchant, it meant fairness in trade. For a parent, it meant kindness and guidance. For a student, humility. Every person had their Dharma, and though it could change with age, class, or circumstance, the essence remained: to live with integrity. Ancient India saw the world as a cosmic order, Artha, the underlying law that made the sun rise and the rivers flow. Dharma was humanity's way of aligning with that order. It was not about punishment or fear of sin. It was about balance. The sages wrote that even the gods followed Dharma, that it was older than creation itself, that without it, the world would descend into chaos. And so, to live without Dharma was to live without meaning. But virtue alone could make life dry, of a life of rules without joy, of obedience without spark. That's where the second pillar entered. Artha, the pulse of prosperity. Artha meant prosperity, not greed, but the art of sustenance. It was about the material foundation that allows everything else to flourish. Wealth, shelter, work, status, all were part of Artha. It was practical wisdom, how to earn, how to save, how to govern, how to make a society thrive. The Artha Shastra, another ancient Indian treatise written around the same era as the Kama Sutra, served as its counterpart. While Vatsyayana wrote about love, Kautilya, or Chanakya, wrote about politics, economy, and statecraft. Together they covered the full range of human life, from palace to bedroom. In Kautilya's world, Artha was not just personal wealth, it was collective stability. A king who ignored Artha would lose his people. A householder who neglected it would lose his family. But Artha too, like Dharma, came with limits. Wealth gained through deceit was considered poison. Prosperity without compassion was hollow. There's a famous line from the Mahabharata that says, "Artha is the root of Dharma and Kama, but when pursued without Dharma, it destroys them both." The message was clear. Success was sacred only when it served balance, not ego. And yet, even with virtue and prosperity, something was missing. Life without joy becomes machinery. The soul hungers for beauty, connection, and intimacy, which brings us to the third and most misunderstood pillar, Kama, the art of desire. In Sanskrit, Kama doesn't just mean pleasure. It means desire in its purest form. The impulse to live, to seek, to connect. It includes sensual pleasure, yes, but also the love of art, the joy of music, the beauty of friendship, and the simple happiness of being alive. The gods themselves were guided by Kama. In myth, Kamadeva, the god of love, is said to have been born from the mind of Brahma, the creator. That means in Indian cosmology, desire itself was divine. Without it, creation would never have begun. To deny Kama entirely was to deny life's creative force, and yet it needed balance. Too much Kama, and one fell into chaos, too little, and one withered. This is where Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra found its voice. It wasn't the first book on Kama, but it was the one that refined it. It didn't just celebrate pleasure, it organized it. It gave it ethics, structure, and art. Vatsyayana treated desire like a discipline, something to be studied, mastered, and experienced with awareness. He wrote not for ascetics nor for libertines, but for people who sought balance between spirit and sensation. His text reminds readers again and again, Kama pursued without Dharma and Artha leads to ruin. But Kama pursued in harmony with them leads to fulfillment. This triad, Dharma, Artha, Kama, was India's great equation. Each sustained the others. Without Dharma, Artha became greed. Without Artha, Kama became fantasy. Without Kama, Dharma became joyless. The beauty of this philosophy lies in its refusal to separate the sacred from the sensual. It understood that a person could pray at dawn, work at noon, and make love at dusk, and that all three could be acts of devotion. Where the Western world later divided body and soul, sin and virtue, India saw them as parts of one current, flowing through all things, a symphony of balance. When Vatsyayana wrote his Kama Sutra, he wasn't adding a scandalous footnote to Indian philosophy, he was completing it. The Dharma Shastras taught how to live rightly. The Artha Shastra taught how to live prosperously. The Kama Sutra taught how to live beautifully, 3 branches of one tree. He didn't write in rebellion against morality, but in harmony with it. To him, desire was not an enemy of virtue, it was its reflection in the mirror of the human heart. And in this, the Kama Sutra became revolutionary, because it didn't just talk about pleasure, but about the responsibility of pleasure. It saw joy as something that should uplift, not exploit, unite, not divide. It taught that beauty and morality were not separate paths, but one. That a person refined in love could be refined in life. That self-awareness in intimacy could lead to self-awareness in everything. This holistic way of thinking ran deep in ancient India's veins. You can see it in the Vedas, where hymns to the gods sit beside songs of longing. You can see it in temple architecture, where erotic carvings stand on sacred walls, not as blasphemy, but as reminders that divinity and desire share the same roots. In that world, to live was to weave all three, Dharma, Artha, and Kama, into one continuous fabric, a life of balance, a life of fullness. And just as Vatsyayana explored that balance between body and spirit, India's philosophers began to ask a deeper question, one that would complete the trilogy entirely. If Dharma is virtue, Artha is survival, and Kama is joy, what lies beyond them all? That question leads into the final pursuit, moksha, liberation, where even pleasure dissolves into peace. But before reaching that spiritual horizon, the Kama Sutra still has more to reveal. Not just about what people did, but how they thought, how they loved, and how they turned the art of living into an act of devotion. Love in the Kama Sutra isn't chaos. It isn't left to accident, impulse, or drunken fate. It's structure, geometry, a slow, deliberate craft, something to be studied with the same seriousness as philosophy or music. Vatsyayana saw love as one of the great human sciences, not the kind that dissects, but the kind that understands. He treated affection the way a mathematician treats symmetry, something that can be observed, practiced, refined, and eventually mastered. To him, attraction was not just a flutter of the heart, it was the meeting of minds, senses, and timing. It wasn't about domination or submission, it was about alignment. Two people learning each other's rhythms until, for a fleeting moment, they move in perfect balance. This was not the love of fairy tales or tragedy, it was deliberate, graceful, intelligent, and in its precision lay its beauty. The Kama Sutra begins not with erotic instruction but with theory, a taxonomy of emotion. Desire, Vatsyayana explains, is universal but not identical. Each person's temperament, body, and capacity for feeling are different. Knowing that, understanding the science of difference, is the first step toward connection. He divides human experience into patterns. How attraction begins, how it grows, how it fades, how it can be rekindled. He describes types of lovers the way a naturalist might describe species, not to judge, but to observe. The timid, the passionate, the clever, the modest, the ardent. Each has their own way of giving and receiving affection. And in that observation lies his quiet brilliance. Love is not a mystery to be feared, but a phenomenon to be understood. To Vatsyayana, ignorance in love was not innocence, it was waste. He writes that just as a musician studies notes or a painter learns brushstrokes, a person must learn the art of touch, timing, conversation, and presence. Karma is not indulgence, it's cultivation. And cultivation, in every sense, takes patience. According to the Kama Sutra, connection begins long before physical union. It begins with darshan, the gaze. The moment two people truly see each other, not just with the eyes, but with the spirit. From there comes sambhoga, the union. But even that is not purely physical. It's a dialogue of gestures, glances, and mutual curiosity. The text goes so far as to describe the subtle rituals of approach, the way lovers should exchange words, scents, gifts, and glances. Courtship is not manipulation, it's choreography. Each move has intention, each pause has meaning. For Vatsyayana, seduction wasn't about conquest, it was about communication. Every gesture, every touch, every silence carried moral weight. He believed that pleasure stripped of respect is empty, that the body is only half the conversation. The other half happens in the mind, and so love becomes a language, one with grammar, tone, and rhythm. When to speak, when to listen, when to approach, when to wait. The Kama Sutra reads almost like sheet music for two instruments learning to play in harmony. One initiates, the other responds. One gives, the other receives. And in that exchange, something transcendent emerges, how not lust, but understanding. Intimacy as knowledge. Vatsyayana lived in an era when knowledge was sacred. To study something was to worship it. And in his hands, intimacy became a kind of prayer. He wrote that to truly know another person, their emotions, their fears, their desires, is one of life's highest achievements. It's not only sensual, it's spiritual. He treats physical intimacy as a form of meditation, a way to transcend ego and glimpse something greater. The merging of two beings is not sin nor indulgence, but revelation. The body becomes a temple, the act becomes an offering, and pleasure becomes awareness. This is perhaps the most misunderstood truth about the Kama Sutra. It is not obsessed with positions, but with presence. It teaches not how to use another person, but how to meet them, fully, respectfully, consciously. To Vatsyayana, the difference between passion and compassion is a single letter, but a world of wisdom. He reminds his readers again and again of the purpose of love is not exhaustion but expansion, not escape but connection, and this connection is not limited to romantic partners. The text speaks of friendship, companionship, and trust. It recognizes love in all its forms, from fleeting infatuation to lifelong devotion. To know love in the Kama Sutra is to know yourself. The mathematics of pleasure. In many ways, Vatsyayana's work mirrors the scientific mindset that would come centuries later. Observation, experimentation. He lists the various ways people express desire through words, gestures, anticipation, not to quantify, but to understand their psychology. He even categorizes lovers based on anatomy and temperament, suggesting ideal matches to balance intensity and gentleness. Modern readers might find it odd, even clinical, but to him this was part of the respect for human complexity. Pleasure, he wrote, is not one size fits all. It is an art of proportions, of listening, of sensitivity. The real skill lies not in performance but in perception. He even suggests that mastery in love is inseparable from moral refinement, that those who love thoughtfully also live thoughtfully. Because what is sensuality, if not awareness sharpened to its finest point? The deeper one reads the Kama Sutra, the more it reveals that it is not about sex at all, at least not primarily. It's about how people relate, how they speak to one another, how they navigate desire and restraint, how they turn pleasure into poetry instead of transaction. Vatsyayana warns against obsession and excess. He praises patience, respect, and timing. The goal is not to consume the other person, but to merge without losing individuality. It's the difference between fire that burns and fire that warms. The idea of tantric union that modern culture borrowed and twisted comes from this very principle, that pleasure, when practiced consciously, becomes a spiritual act. Through attention, through breath, through surrender. Vatsyayana doesn't preach asceticism or indulgence. He offers the middle path, awareness, the ability to stay awake inside desire. And that awareness, once mastered, spills over into everything else, how you eat, speak, work, think, how you live. Love, in this worldview, is an ecosystem. It cannot survive without kindness, patience, and curiosity. A relationship, Vatsyayana says, is not a possession, but a practice, something that must be tended like a garden. The weeds of jealousy, neglect, and pride can choke it. But with care, it grows into a form of beauty that enriches both souls. He often refers to the lover as both student and teacher, each learning from the other. In this exchange, the boundaries blur. Desire becomes education. Companionship becomes enlightenment. And this, ultimately, is the genius of the Kama Sutra. It redefines love not as a feeling, but as a discipline, an ongoing refinement of empathy, attention, and art. It's the study of what it means to connect, to give, and to be seen. As Vatsyayana explored the intricacies of affection and intimacy, his world was already shifting. Kingdoms rising, philosophies evolving, temples blooming with stone-carved allegories of union. Soon, this art of connection would extend beyond the individual, shaping culture, architecture, and even the divine itself. Because in ancient India, love wasn't confined to the private. It was written on the walls of temples and whispered through myths, transforming from human longing into sacred symbolism. Imagine stepping into the heart of an ancient Indian city, the air warm, spiced, and shimmering with sound. Elephants groan through the market streets. Merchants shout prices in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Tamil. The scent of sandalwood and sesame oil mingles with smoke from temple lamps. Silk rustles, anklets chime, and laughter drifts through carved balconies. This was Pataliputra, the great capital of empires like the Mauryas and Guptas, a city that once stood as the glittering soul of the subcontinent. Here, love and ambition, devotion and indulgence all lived side by side. To understand the Kama Sutra, you must first understand this world. Urban, layered, and alive with contradictions. It was not born in a monastery or a remote hermit's cave. It was born in the hum of city life, among courtyards, musicians, poets, and courtesans. It was a product of civilization at its peak, when India's cities were centers of philosophy, art, and pleasure, where the sacred and the sensual often shared the same breath. Pataliputra, located on the banks of the Ganges, was one of the most advanced cities of its age. Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador who visited in the 3rd century BCE, described it as vast and orderly, with wide streets, gardens, and fortified walls. But what struck foreign visitors most wasn't its architecture, it was its culture. This was a society that studied everything, from astronomy to music, from mathematics to love. Education wasn't limited to monasteries or the elite. Artisans, dancers, philosophers, and courtesans all had roles in shaping the city's rhythm. Temples, theatres, and salons were places of gathering, where people debated philosophy, listened to poetry, or simply sought company. Pleasure was not shameful. It was part of the city's design. Here, the art of living, Kama Sutra, was as respected as the arts of virtue, Dharma, and wealth, Artha. At the center of this refined society were the Ganikas, courtesans. But the word courtesan fails to capture who they truly were. These women were artists, conversationalists, poets, and musicians. They were trained from a young age in music, dance, perfume making, and the art of conversation. In a world where most women were confined to domestic roles, courtesans were paradoxically free. They could own property, earn wealth, and even influence politics. The Kama Sutra devotes an entire section to them, not as objects, but as complex individuals navigating a world where love and commerce intertwined. Vatsyayana writes of them with admiration, not pity. He describes their intelligence, their discipline, and their power of charm. They were not merely companions, they were cultural icons, embodiments of refinement and independence. And yet, their lives were not simple. Behind the glamour lay struggle, a constant balance between art and survival. Courtesans were expected to be emotionally strong, strategic, and perceptive, managing clients, finances, and reputation with precision. Still within their salons, something rare happened. Love became performance, but also philosophy. To sit in a courtesan's chamber was to enter a space where perfume, poetry, and psychology mixed. The air itself seemed designed for understanding human nature. In the grand bazaar of Pataliputra, love and trade were both currencies. Jewelry, silk, and poetry moved through the same hands. Even affection had its market, not in a cynical sense, but as a mirror of urban life. People negotiated affection as they negotiated prices, with charm, persuasion, and ritual. There were love letters written on palm leaves, perfumes mixed to match one's temperament, and matchmakers who navigated social ranks and fortunes. For the wealthy and powerful, relationships were often strategic. Marriages tied families and kingdoms together. But outside those alliances, the city thrived on the play of attraction, a freer, more personal world where affection could exist for its own sake. The Kama Sutra doesn't moralize about this. It accepts it as part of human nature. It recognizes that desire, whether romantic or transactional, was part of the urban pulse. But it also warns that love without restraint leads to ruin. Vatsyayana's voice cuts through like a teacher in a crowded street. Pleasure must serve life, not rule it. Everywhere you turned, art celebrated love. In courtyards and temples, stone carvings captured tender embraces and playful glances. Walls and pillars were alive with stories, not of shame, but of beauty. Erotic art wasn't hidden. It was displayed in the open, alongside scenes of music, dance, and ritual. It reflected a worldview that didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. Painters, sculptors, and poets worked from the same philosophy, that the human body, in its grace and movement, was a reflection of the divine order. A dancer's gesture was not mere performance, it was meditation. A kiss carved into stone was not sin, it was truth captured in form. In the city of lovers, art was never just art, it was philosophy made visible. Urban India, for all its openness, still had rules. Class, caste, and decorum shaped interactions between men and women. The Kama Sutra reflects this complexity. It describes how a nobleman should approach a woman of equal standing, or how a merchant might court a widow or courtesan with grace and tact. Every gesture was governed by etiquette. Love required intelligence as much as emotion. There were lessons on writing letters, choosing gifts, speaking softly, and maintaining dignity even in rejection. What's striking is how equal some of these relationships appear. The text gives women agency. They choose lovers, set boundaries, and test sincerity. In a society built on hierarchy, love became the one space where power could shift, where wit, charm, and understanding mattered more than birth. As the sun sank behind the Ganges, Pataliputra glowed in lamplight. The markets quieted, and the city took on a different pulse. Courtesans' salons filled with laughter and music. Poets recited verses about longing and fate. Young lovers met under trees near temple ponds, their whispers mingling with the sound of water. This was when the Kama Sutra came alive, not as words on a palm leaf, but as life itself. Vatsyayana must have walked these same streets, observing people as they lived, loved, and pretended. His work was not theoretical, it was reportage, a portrait of the city's soul. He saw that in every flirtation, every heartbreak, every reunion, there was a pattern, an art worth preserving. And so he wrote, not for kings or priests, but for anyone curious about what it means to be human in a crowded, restless world. In the Kama Sutra, the city itself becomes a metaphor for desire. Its bustling streets mirror the movement of thought. Its lights mirror the flicker of emotion. Its noise mirrors the mind's longing for stillness. The city teaches patience, curiosity, and adaptability, the same virtues needed in love. Vatsyayana's world was urban, but his lessons were universal. How to live beautifully among others, how to love without losing oneself, and how to turn the chaos of emotion into a dance of understanding. In that sense, the Kama Sutra was never just about lovers. It was about society, how people, bound by desire and duty, learned to coexist. And nowhere was that lesson clearer than in the glowing, murmuring streets of Pataliputra, the city of lovers, the cradle of connection, where even the night seemed to hum with the rhythm of human longing. Somewhere beyond those lamplit courtyards, beyond the songs of the courtesans and the laughter of the lovers, a deeper truth waited, one that reached past passion and performance into something divine. Because, for ancient India, love was never merely human, it was the reflection of something greater, a cosmic union that echoed in art, ritual, and myth. Step inside a salon in ancient Pataliputra. The lamps are low, the air thick with jasmine and cardamom. Music drifts through silk curtains. A courtesan sits on a carved sandalwood couch, surrounded by poets, merchants, and noblemen. Her laughter, light, deliberate, controls the room. This is not a woman hidden behind a veil, nor bound by household duties. She is the Ganika, the courtesan. And in the world of the Kama Sutra, she is not an ornament. She is an institution. In Vatsyayana's time, courtesans were not just entertainers. They were educated, influential, and deeply respected within the complex urban fabric of Indian society. They studied literature, music, dance, and politics. They knew poetry, perfume making, etiquette, and strategy. They could compose verses, quote philosophy, and discuss the art of conversation with the same ease as a scholar. They were trained not only to please, but to perceive, to read gestures, silences, and intentions. In a society where women of noble households lived within walls, the courtesans walked freely through the public world, hosting salons, attending gatherings, and sometimes even advising rulers. They understood how the city worked, how power shifted, and how affection could turn to influence. The Kama Sutra treats them not as subjects of pity or scandal, but as embodiments of grace, wit, and autonomy. Vatsyayana's text does something radical for its time. It listens to women. It records their speech, their thoughts, their desires, not as rumors or fantasies, but as valid truths. In many parts of the text, women speak in the first person. They advise, they argue, they question. The Kama Sutra includes dialogues between courtesans, wives, and lovers discussing topics like fidelity, strategy, and emotional intelligence. In one section, a woman explains how to test a lover's sincerity, to observe his gestures, his tone, and the consistency of his affection. Another passage describes how women should educate themselves in the arts, not to serve men, but to enrich their own lives. In these verses, Vatsyayana presents women as thinkers, not merely as muses. For a text written nearly 2,000 years ago, this was quietly revolutionary. Courtesans lived at the intersection of love and economy, where beauty met business and affection became a form of strategy. They were, in many ways, entrepreneurs. The Kama Sutra outlines how a courtesan should manage her wealth, choose patrons wisely, and maintain independence. It teaches her how to invest her earnings, avoid emotional manipulation, and protect her dignity. Vatsyayana even advises them to balance affection with calculation, to give warmth where it is deserved, but never to surrender autonomy. This might sound cold to modern ears, but in context, It was survival. In a society where power often flowed through men, courtesans learned to master the language of influence. They could turn charm into security, intellect into respect. They lived by their wit, not inheritance. The Kama Sutra acknowledges this with unusual empathy. It doesn't condemn them for living outside traditional norms. It studies them, almost admiringly, as complex individuals who turned constraint into agency. The courtesan's world existed in delicate balance. She was both admired and judged, desired by kings yet excluded from marriage. Society depended on her artistry, but denied her legitimacy. And still she thrived. Her life was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be reduced to one role. While housewives represented stability and virtue, courtesans represented movement and change, the fluid energy of a world in transition. The Kama Sutra positions both as equally necessary to the social fabric. The wife sustains the household, the courtesan sustains the imagination. In that way, the text recognizes a truth that many civilizations have ignored, that culture often grows in the spaces between restraint and freedom. What makes the Kama Sutra extraordinary is how it gives courtesans not only social presence, but philosophical depth. Vatsyayana doesn't describe them as mere performers of pleasure. He portrays them as philosophers of human behavior, people who understand desire not just as emotion, but as a science. A courtesan's art, he suggests, lies in perception, in knowing when to speak, when to listen, when to withdraw. She studies men as carefully as a scholar studies stars. She knows that affection, like commerce, follows patterns, that love without discipline can ruin both parties. In her salon, emotion becomes education. Every encounter is a lesson in human psychology. This is why many historians believe that the courtesans of India were among the first to practice a kind of social science, observing, recording, and refining the behaviors that governed intimacy and society. Their power was not political in the usual sense, it was intellectual. To the courtesan, beauty was never skin deep. It was composed, like poetry. The Kama Sutra describes beauty as the harmony of grace, knowledge, and emotional intelligence. A woman's charm lay not only in her appearance, but in her timing, her tone, her ability to make others feel understood. There's a passage where Vatsyayana writes that the courtesan should know the hearts of men better than they know themselves. It's both a compliment and a warning, a recognition that empathy, when sharpened, becomes a form of control. This was her true art, the mastery of connection. In an age before psychology, she understood attention, attraction, and attachment, how to spark them, and how to end them without bitterness. That, perhaps, was the most astonishing power of all. The courtesan's presence reveals something essential about ancient India, that it was a society comfortable with complexity. It didn't divide women into saints and sinners, as later cultures would. It saw them as participants in a vast social dance, each with roles, risks, and freedoms. The Kama Sutra doesn't idealize this world, but it doesn't deny it either. It documents it, a living anthropology of emotion. Courtesans were the mirror through which the city saw its own contradictions. Refinement beside poverty, artistry beside exploitation, devotion beside desire. They existed because civilization needed them, to translate raw longing into ritual, to civilize passion without denying it. In their salons, poetry replaced politics and emotion became dialogue. Power in the courtesan's hands looked different. It wasn't the power to conquer or command, it was the power to influence, to steer emotion, shape behavior, and challenge hierarchy from within the system. Some courtesans became patrons of the arts, others advised nobles or helped negotiate alliances. a few left behind verses still quoted today. Their presence in the Kama Sutra proves that Vatsyayana understood love not just as pleasure, but as politics, a subtle negotiation of need, attraction, and intellect. He saw that intimacy, too, had its hierarchies, and those who mastered it could move mountains, not by force, but by persuasion. Long after their salons faded, the courtesan's influence lingered in poetry, music, and myth. Their manner of speech shaped classical drama. Their elegance influenced royal etiquette. Even in later centuries, echoes of their world would survive in India's dance traditions and storytelling arts. But in the Kama Sutra, they live forever, not as fantasies, but as thinkers. Vatsyayana gives them what few ancient texts gave any woman: a voice, a mind, a presence that could look back at society and say, "I exist and I understand." And through that voice, the Kama Sutra does something far greater than cataloguing pleasure. It redefines power, not as domination but as understanding, because to know desire, to study it, shape it, and give it meaning is to master the oldest force that ever moved the human heart. And somewhere, in the next chapter of this story, that force begins to shift again, from the courtesan's chamber to the temple's inner sanctum, where love itself becomes divine. Imagine two lovers beneath an oil lamp, its flame flickering against carved stone. Outside, the city hums with merchants, elephants, and the echo of conch shells from distant temples. Inside, there's quiet, a silence not empty, but charged. A look, a breath, a hand that hesitates for just a second longer than it should. That pause, that wordless understanding, is where the Kama Sutra lives. For all its reputation as a manual, the text is really a study in language, not the language of words, but of glances, gestures, rhythm, and attention, a vocabulary written not in ink, but in awareness. Before the world invented psychology, before anyone spoke of emotional intelligence, ancient India had already mapped the grammar of connection. Vatsyayana never treats pleasure as something crude or mechanical. To him, it is dialogue. Every touch, every look, every pause is a form of conversation, one that only works if both people listen. He insists that pleasure without understanding is incomplete. Desire must be answered by sensitivity. Passion must be guided by awareness. He writes that the true art of love is not domination but mutual rhythm, learning to read another person's breath, their comfort, their curiosity. In his world, pleasure isn't about possession, it's about synchrony, two people becoming fluent in the same unspoken language. To the ancient Indian imagination, the body was a poem, full of metaphors, rhythm, and sacred geometry. The Kama Sutra borrows its language from poetry because, in that culture, there was no sharp line between the sensual and the spiritual. Both were expressions of beauty, both celebrated harmony and proportion. When Vatsyayana describes physical love, he does so like a poet describing music, measured, attentive, lyrical. He uses imagery of rivers, moonlight, rain, and blooming flowers not to decorate, but to translate emotion into something tangible. Every gesture becomes a verse, every sigh a stanza. This poetic tone is deliberate. It elevates desire from instinct to expression, from something merely physical to something meaningful. It tells us that intimacy, when done right, isn't chaos, it's choreography. The ancient Indians loved symbols. They believed that everything, the moon, the lotus, the ocean, reflected something deeper in human experience. So when the Kama Sutra speaks of union, it isn't just describing two bodies, it's describing the balance of opposites, sun and moon, stillness and movement, self and other. Desire, in this sense, becomes a way of understanding the universe. To study pleasure is to study balance, how to give and receive, how to lead and follow, how to be both firm and gentle, bold and tender. This is why the Kama Sutra often uses metaphors of nature. Because nature itself is sensual. It grows, it changes, it responds. A flower does not bloom through force, it opens through patience. So too, the text says, does love. Modern psychology often speaks of empathy, the ability to understand and share another's feelings. Vatsyayana understood that long before it had a name. He wrote that the ideal lover must possess manasajna, the knowledge of the mind. It means being able to sense what another person feels without them needing to speak. To notice when they're shy or tired or pretending to be indifferent. To feel the temperature of the room shift, the rhythm of conversation falter, the energy of presence change. This awareness was considered not just romantic, but ethical. To be attentive was to be moral. To ignore your partner's feelings was to act with spiritual ignorance, a kind of emotional blindness. The Kama Sutra teaches that real connection is not achieved by technique, but by listening with the whole self. It's an art, one that begins with curiosity, not confidence. Pleasure, Vatsyayana says, is not found in the act itself, but in its pacing. The anticipation, the restraint, the subtlety, all of it builds tension like music builds melody. In this he mirrors the Indian concept of rasa, the aesthetic experience of emotion. Rasa is not about the event, but the feeling it creates. The right pause, the right glance, the right silence, these create rasa. They turn intimacy into something felt, remembered, savored. Even the idea of touch is treated like rhythm. The text describes how movement should flow, how pauses should align, how presence can speak louder than words. It's an understanding of love as an art form, one that requires timing, empathy, and practice. Because when rhythm fails, harmony collapses, and when it aligns, everything sings. The Kama Sutra does not assume people are born knowing how to love well. It assumes love must be learned. It teaches observation, how to notice what brings joy, what causes discomfort, what deepens connection. It teaches patience, that every person is a new book to read, a new pattern to understand. And it teaches humility, that love is never mastered, only practiced. Vatsyayana believed that to love intelligently was the highest refinement of human nature, because love, unlike lust, requires interpretation. It's an endless conversation, and the best lovers are those who never stop learning the dialect of another's soul. In the Kama Sutra, emotion isn't seen as weakness, it's treated as wisdom, a guide to understanding yourself and others. Jealousy, affection, hesitation. These are not dismissed as distractions, but studied as signals. A jealous lover, for example, is not shamed but analyzed. What fear lies beneath that jealousy? What need for reassurance? A timid lover is not mocked, but encouraged to grow in trust. This sensitivity to emotional states makes the text astonishingly modern. It sees feelings as information, valuable data in the experiment of intimacy. Every relationship, it suggests, is a laboratory for self-knowledge. You learn about others, yes, but mostly you learn about yourself. What makes the Kama Sutra timeless isn't its physical descriptions, but its psychological insight. It understands that the greatest pleasure isn't in the act. It's in being seen, understood, and desired, not just for your body, but your being. It's in the way someone looks at you and truly knows you. That moment, wordless, honest, complete, is what the text calls samyoga, true union. It's not about possession, it's about recognition. Two consciousnesses meeting briefly in perfect awareness. That's what all the technique, poetry, and philosophy aim toward, a fleeting instant of shared understanding so deep it feels divine. If there's one secret the Kama Sutra whispers across centuries, it's this: love has grammar. Like language, it has structure, tone, timing, punctuation. A gesture too soon can ruin meaning. A silence too long can shift intent. Every act, every touch, every sigh has its syntax. To love well is to speak well, not with words, but with presence. And just as a poet refines verses for beauty, a lover refines behavior for harmony. This is why the Kama Sutra reads more like a conversation manual than a technical guide. It's teaching of fluency, not in desire alone, but in perception, patience, and play. In the salons of courtesans, in the chambers of lovers, and in the quiet courtyards of married homes, this language of pleasure once shaped how people connected, emotionally, spiritually, even politically. It was never just about indulgence, it was about literacy, the ability to read another soul. And just beyond this world of glances and gestures, the next chapter begins to unfold, where love transcends the body entirely, transforming into something cosmic, something sacred, the divine dance of passion and prayer. The story of the Kama Sutra's encounter with the West begins not with philosophy, but with scandal. For centuries, the text slept quietly in India's libraries and temples, copied by hand, recited by scholars, whispered between lovers, and studied by philosophers. It was part of a vast cultural tapestry that wove together spirituality, duty, and desire. But when the British arrived, they saw none of that. To them, it was something altogether different, exotic, forbidden, and dangerously indecent. When British colonial scholars first encountered the Kama Sutra, they did so through the eyes of empire, filtered by Victorian morality and the assumption of Western superiority. They came from a world that treated sex as shameful and private, governed by rules of restraint and piety. In 19th century England, even the legs of pianos were sometimes covered with fabric because the word leg itself was considered too suggestive. So imagine their shock when they opened the Kama Sutra, a text that spoke of desire openly, elegantly, even reverently. Where they expected depravity, they found philosophy. Where they sought anthropology, they found art. But the Western mind of the time couldn't quite reconcile the two. To them, India's sacred eroticism was not enlightenment, and it was temptation. Something to both study and suppress. The Kama Sutra was not lost to India, it was always there. But to the West it was discovered in 1883 when an English Orientalist named Sir Richard Francis Burton secretly translated it into English. Burton was no ordinary scholar. He was a linguist, adventurer, and provocateur, a man fascinated by the sensual and the taboo. But he also lived in a time when publishing a book about sex could destroy your career, or worse, land you in prison. So he devised a plan. He created something called the Kama Sutra Society, a fake private printing club that allowed him to publish sexually explicit works under the pretense of academic research. The first English Kama Sutra was printed in limited copies, intended only for the eyes of gentlemen scholars. But of course, it leaked. And when it did, the scandal began. By the early 1900s, the Kama Sutra had become a whispered legend in London. It was the book respectable people pretended not to own, but secretly passed among themselves in brown paper wrapping. Publishers were arrested for selling it. Customs officials burned shipments of it. Yet the more the British tried to suppress it, the more the public wanted it. The Kama Sutra became a mirror for the Victorian psyche, a reflection of everything it denied itself. It was not India that was obsessed with sex. It was the West projecting its own repression onto the East. The tragedy of Burton's translation, and those that followed, is that they stripped the Kama Sutra of its context. Burton saw it through a lens of curiosity, but also through Orientalist fantasy. He exaggerated its exoticism, glossed over its spiritual depth, and presented it as a manual of Eastern passion rather than a sophisticated guide to human relationships. Many Western readers, encountering it for the first time, mistook it for pornography. They saw only positions and technique, not the philosophy behind them. What was once a meditation on harmony and emotional intelligence was reduced to spectacle. The Kama Sutra became not a book of wisdom, but a commodity, fetishized, sensationalized, and endlessly misunderstood. In Victorian England, morality was law. The state policed not only behavior but thought. Yet in India, under the same empire, there existed a tradition that saw pleasure as sacred and self-knowledge as virtue. To British sensibilities, this was a contradiction. To Indian philosophy, it was balance. The Kama Sutra did not teach indulgence for its own sake. It taught moderation, awareness, and the pursuit of beauty in every aspect of life. But colonial interpreters could not see this nuance, because to see it would mean acknowledging that another civilization might have understood the human soul more deeply than their own. And so they categorized it as heathen, licentious, and immoral. They outlawed erotic art. They defaced temple sculptures. They turned open celebration into shame. The British didn't just mistranslate the Kama Sutra. They rewired the cultural consciousness of an entire society. The irony was striking. While the British condemned the Kama Sutra in India, they devoured it in secret at home. This hypocrisy exposed something uncomfortable, that their outrage was never about morality, but about control. Censorship was power. To dictate what was decent was to dictate how a people should think and feel. In silencing India's discourse on love and pleasure, the empire sought to civilize what it could not comprehend, and yet the more they censored, the louder the Kama Sutra's whisper became, crossing borders, igniting imaginations, and quietly undermining the very prudishness that sought to erase it. By the mid-20th century, the Kama Sutra had been absorbed into Western pop culture. But it wasn't the Kama Sutra Vatsyayana had written. It was a fantasy. Magazines, advertisements, and movies began using its name to sell everything from perfume to furniture. The West turned it into a symbol of the mystical East, a land of silk, incense, and erotic secrets. The spiritual became sensual. The philosophical became commercial. It was no longer a text about understanding love. It was an aesthetic, a marketing tool. And in that transformation, something precious was lost. The quiet intelligence, the compassion, the moral grace that lay at the heart of the original. When Indian publishers tried to print the Kama Sutra in English decades later, they faced the same Victorian laws the British had left behind. Even after independence, the text was banned, censored, or hidden behind disclaimers. It was as if the shame imported from the West had seeped into India's own bloodstream. A civilization that once saw desire as divine now whispered its own heritage in embarrassment. The irony is almost painful. A sacred Indian philosophy, shunned in its birthplace because of colonial modesty, yet celebrated in Western bedrooms as a symbol of liberation. The Kama Sutra fascinated the West not because it was perverse, but because it was free. It offered a worldview that did not divide the soul and the body, that saw sensuality as natural, and love as something to be cultivated, not feared. For the Victorians, who lived under rigid hierarchies and moral repression, this was both alluring and terrifying. In a way, the Western obsession with the Kama Sutra revealed more about the West than about India. It exposed a culture struggling with its own shadow, craving what it condemned, desiring what it denied. What began as curiosity became caricature, By the time the Kama Sutra entered modern bookstores, its true meaning had been buried under layers of Western projection. It was no longer a guide to harmony, but a list of acrobatics. Yet beneath the scandal and the misreadings, the original voice of Vatsyayana still hums softly, reminding the world that love, at its core, is not a spectacle, but a study. Not indulgence, but insight. And as the Kama Sutra crossed oceans and centuries, it carried with it a quiet question, one that still lingers today. Can a civilization that separates mind and body ever truly understand one that unites them? That question seeks of harmony and division, of sacred and sensual, would echo into the modern age, reshaping how both India and the world would come to see desire, identity, and freedom. And that is where the next chapter begins. By the late 19th century, the British Empire stood proudly at its peak, an empire that claimed to civilize the world while quietly trembling at the thought of its own human desires. London's streets were polished, its manners perfected, and its morals wrapped tightly in lace and denial. But beneath the perfume and prayer books there pulsed a secret hunger, one that the Kama Sutra would both expose and inflame. The British ruled India with one hand and blushed at it with the other. They collected its art, studied its scriptures, admired its architecture, yet condemned its sensuality. They built museums to house Indian statues while chiseling away anything that looked remotely erotic. They studied Sanskrit but censored what the language dared to say about pleasure. And that is the paradox at the heart of this era. An empire obsessed with control, discovering a civilization that celebrated surrender. Victorian England was a strange place, a society that preached purity while inventing the brothel system. Morality was currency, appearances were everything. Men went to church on Sunday and to secret clubs on Monday. Women were expected to be angels, silent, spotless, self-sacrificing. It was an age terrified of touch. The word pregnant was considered indecent for polite conversation. Even scientific discussions of anatomy required euphemisms. And yet, behind closed doors, the same society that banned books like the Kama Sutra couldn't stop buying them. The more forbidden something became, the more intoxicating it was. The Kama Sutra arrived in this climate like a spark in a room full of gas lamps. To the Victorians, it was not a spiritual guide. It was a scandal wrapped in Sanskrit. When Victorian travellers wrote about India, they didn't see a land of balance or philosophy. They saw a stage, a place where they could project their own suppressed fantasies. India became, in the colonial imagination, the Orient, mysterious, sensual, decadent, and dangerous. A world of veiled women, perfumed courtyards, and silk beds. A world that existed less as reality and more as fantasy. The opposite of everything Britain claimed to be. This image sold. Writers, artists, and explorers fed the myth. Paintings of half-draped temple dancers, novels about forbidden love in exotic lands, travelogues that hinted at secret rites. The Victorian public devoured them all. They were titillated by the East's supposed excess because it offered something their own world denied them, emotional freedom. And so the Kama Sutra became part of that myth, a symbol of the seductive Orient, an object of curiosity and control. When Sir Richard Burton translated the Kama Sutra in 1883, he wasn't just publishing a book, he was poking the bear of British morality. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 had made it illegal to print or distribute any material deemed indecent. But Burton was clever. He disguised the translation under his private Kama Shastra Society, arguing that it was for scholarly study only. In truth, it was a loophole and an act of rebellion. The translation circulated in whispers through secret societies and private libraries. But even this limited distribution was enough to provoke outrage. Clergymen condemned it from pulpits, newspapers hinted at it in scandal columns, customs officers seized copies at ports, burning them before they reached readers, and yet every attempt to suppress it only made it more desirable. The Victorians, masters of repression, had created their own forbidden fruit. Once the Kama Sutra entered Western circulation, it began to lose its soul. Publishers, eager for profit, stripped away the Sanskrit poetry and commentary, leaving behind what they thought people wanted: diagrams, descriptions, and innuendo. By the early 20th century, it wasn't seen as philosophy anymore. It was pornography dressed in academic robes. The Oriental aesthetic, carved elephants, incense, and embroidered cushions, became a backdrop for erotic fantasy. The Kama Sutra's spiritual complexity was reduced to a shorthand for the exotic and the erotic. Postcards, illustrations, even burlesque performances began referencing it. The text had traveled thousands of miles and hundreds of years only to become a Victorian daydream, something to be ogled, not understood. What fascinated the Victorians about the Kama Sutra wasn't just its content, it was the freedom it represented. Here was a culture that didn't hide from desire, but integrated it into life, philosophy, and spirituality. To people raised in silence and shame, that was both horrifying and magnetic. It forced the British to confront their own contradictions. They ruled India as the moral superior. Yet their empire depended on exploitation and indulgence. They called Indian art obscene, yet funded colonial officers who bought erotic sculptures for private collections. It wasn't the Kama Sutra that was shocking. It was the hypocrisy of those who feared it. In an attempt to civilize India, the British began purging what they considered immoral from public life. Temples with erotic carvings were labeled indecent and whitewashed. Statues were hidden behind curtains in museums. Sacred texts were reclassified as curiosities. The colonial project wasn't just about land or trade, it was about narrative. They wanted to define what was pure and what was perverse, what was enlightened and what was primitive. The Kama Sutra stood in their way because it embodied something deeply threatening, a worldview in which pleasure, beauty, and virtue could coexist. To suppress it was to rewrite civilization itself, to replace India's philosophy of balance with the West's theology of guilt. As the Victorian era faded and the 20th century dawned, repression gave way to commerce. The Kama Sutra became fashionable again, but now as a luxury item. Fine print editions were sold to collectors. French publishers issued illustrated versions under the guise of art. Hollywood referenced it in whispers. By the 1960s, amid the sexual revolution, it resurfaced once more, this time as a banner of liberation. But even then, what the world rediscovered wasn't Vatsyayana's wisdom. It was the ghost of a book rewritten by centuries of Western desire. The Kama Sutra had been packaged, exoticized, and exported so many times that its core philosophy, about empathy, communication, and balance, was barely visible beneath the layers of fantasy. There's a cruel irony in how the British treated the Kama Sutra. They mocked it, banned it, and yet couldn't stop consuming it. It exposed a truth that haunted the empire, that control and repression breed obsession. The Victorians tried to cage desire, but the more they hid it, the stronger it grew. And in that struggle, they accidentally turned India's most balanced philosophy into their own forbidden mythology. To dominate a culture, they had to distort it. To justify their control, they had to make its beauty seem dangerous. But in doing so, they revealed the fragility of their own civilization, one built not on understanding, but on fear. Even after the empire fell, its shadow lingered. The shame it imposed seeped deep into India's consciousness. Suddenly, the land that gave birth to the Kama Sutra felt compelled to hide it. Schools avoided teaching it. Artists hesitated to reference it. Temples once seen as divine became vulgar in the eyes of their own descendants. Victorian prudishness had outlived the Victorians, and that is perhaps the empire's strangest legacy. Not the railways, not the bureaucracy, but the internalized belief that pleasure is sin and beauty must be hidden. Yet the Kama Sutra endures. Beneath the layers of colonial censorship and exotic fantasy, its quiet truth remains. That love is not a vice, and desire, when understood, is divine. And as the story moves forward, we begin to see how modern India, the modern world, would wrestle with that truth, reclaiming what empire once tried to erase. Picture London in the late 1800s, a city of fog, formality, and feverish curiosity. Gas lamps flicker on cobblestones, printing presses clatter through the night, and in the parlours of scholars and explorers, the empire is busy cataloguing the world. Insects, spices, languages, people, and gods. Everything can be measured, named, and controlled. And then, among all these specimens of empire, something slips through the cracks. A Sanskrit manuscript whispered about in colonial circles, rumoured to contain the forbidden philosophy of love. A text so scandalous, they say, it could never be spoken aloud in polite society. This is how the Kama Sutra found its way to the desk of Sir Richard Francis Burton, soldier, linguist, spy, and one of the strangest, boldest minds of his time. He wasn't the kind of man the Victorians liked to claim as one of their own. He spoke 29 languages, translated Arabian Nights, disguised himself as a Muslim pilgrim to infiltrate Mecca, and had a fascination with the erotic and the esoteric that made even his peers uneasy. To Burton, desire wasn't something to fear. It was something to study, to understand, even to respect. So when he stumbled upon the Kama Sutra, he didn't see a scandal. He saw anthropology, philosophy, humanity, and perhaps a mirror. Burton first learned about the Kama Sutra through whispers among Orientalist scholars and Sanskrit translators stationed in India. Colonial officials collected ancient texts like trophies, but they rarely understood them. Many were locked away in archives, too obscene, too foreign, too alive. But Burton had never been afraid of the forbidden. He commissioned a translation, working with Indian scholars and Sanskrit experts, poring over manuscripts line by line. What he discovered wasn't the crude catalogue of erotic positions that his society imagined. It was something far deeper, a philosophy of balance between body, mind, and spirit. Yet Burton knew exactly what kind of storm he was summoning. Victorian England was a country that fainted at the sight of bare ankles. Its lawmakers had passed the Obscene Publications Act in 1857, banning any printed material deemed indecent. Merely publishing the Kama Sutra could mean prison. So Burton did what he always did. He bent the rules. To protect himself, Burton founded a secretive, semi-fictional group called the Kama Sutra Society. Officially, it was a private circle of academics studying ancient Indian literature. In reality, it was a loophole, a smokescreen that allowed him to print and distribute restricted material to subscribers only. In 1883, after years of work and subterfuge, the first English translation of the Kama Sutra was privately printed in London. It wasn't advertised and it wasn't sold openly. Copies were hand-bound, distributed discreetly, and numbered. Only a few hundred were made. Each one was technically legal, but only barely. And yet, despite the secrecy, word spread fast. The Kama Sutra had arrived in the West, not as scripture, but as scandal. Burton's translation was both groundbreaking and deeply flawed. He had smuggled a sacred Indian text through the walls of British censorship, but to do so, he had to cut it into shapes that his audience could tolerate. Some parts were softened, some were left out entirely. Burton added his own footnotes filled with anthropological musings and questionable racial theories that reflected the prejudices of his age. He often used euphemisms, embrace, union, sport, to describe acts that the original Sanskrit treated as ordinary aspects of life. And when the text referred to courtesans or same-sex relationships, Burton's pen hesitated. His translation veiled what the Sanskrit stated plainly. He wanted to preserve the soul of the work, but he also wanted to survive Victorian society, a delicate balance between honesty and heresy. So while Burton brought the Kama Sutra to English readers, he also dressed it up in colonial costume, polite enough for libraries, exotic enough for curiosity, and distant enough to remain safely other. There's a haunting irony to Burton's legacy. He saw himself as a liberator of knowledge, a scholar reclaiming what prudish Europe had lost, an understanding of sensuality as sacred. Yet his version of the Kama Sutra became the very thing he feared, a misunderstood artifact, read for titillation rather than wisdom. He had opened the door, but not wide enough. His notes dripped with fascination and superiority in equal measure, admiration for India's ancient openness, but also the colonial arrogance of translation as conquest. To the British reader, Burton's Kama Sutra was not India speaking for itself. It was India filtered through an English gentleman's gaze. In the decades that followed, Burton's edition took on a mythic status. It was whispered about in university halls, banned by customs officers, and read by candlelight by people who claimed not to have it. Collectors paid fortunes for copies. Smugglers carried it across borders in hidden compartments. For a book that preached balance and serenity, it caused extraordinary chaos. And while most of its readers had never seen a word of Sanskrit, they believed they now held the secret of Eastern pleasure. But the truth was more complicated. Burton's translation, while bold, had subtly changed the Kama Sutra's tone. The Sanskrit original was warm, poetic, and precise. It spoke of love with reverence, not lust. It discussed marriage, etiquette, trust, and emotional connection with equal weight to physical union. In Burton's hands, much of that softness became clinical, or worse, exotic. The text that had once described the union of souls became, in English, a catalogue of curiosities. Burton often blurred the line between scholar and voyeur. He was genuinely fascinated by human sexuality, but his curiosity was tinged with performance, the thrill of being the man who dared. He studied taboo subjects not just to understand them, but to prove that he could go where others wouldn't. In a sense, he was the perfect man for the Kama Sutra, and its worst interpreter. He admired India's sensual philosophy but couldn't fully escape the mindset of his empire. To him, the Kama Sutra was a relic of a noble but decadent civilization, a beautiful ruin from a golden age long gone. That framing would define how the West viewed the book for the next century. When news of Burton's translation leaked, Britain reacted exactly as expected. With denial and desire, the upper classes condemned it, while secretly ordering it through intermediaries. Moral crusaders decried its obscenity, while the black market couldn't print copies fast enough. The hypocrisy was staggering. A book written by an Indian monk to teach restraint, empathy, and connection was being smuggled through back alleys of London as a forbidden sex manual. And in the process, the Kama Sutra became both a trophy and a taboo, an object of fascination precisely because it revealed what British society refused to face, that its moral purity was built on repression, not virtue. Despite the distortions, Burton's translation changed everything. It opened a forbidden door, not just for readers, but for translators, historians, and philosophers who came after him. For the first time in centuries, the Kama Sutra had re-entered the global conversation, and while it was misread and mishandled, It was no longer buried. In the 20th century, new scholars would revisit the Sanskrit text, correcting, expanding, and reclaiming what Burton's version had left behind. But for now, in this moment of candlelight and secrecy, the Kama Sutra sat on a British shelf, mislabeled, misunderstood, but alive once more. A quiet survivor of empire, waiting to be rediscovered again. By the mid-20th century, the Kama Sutra was no longer a whispered secret among scholars and collectors. It had become something else entirely. A brand, a punchline, a glossy icon of Eastern exoticism stamped on candles, hotels, and coffee table books. In the Western imagination, it was no longer scripture or philosophy. It was shorthand for something titillating, foreign, and faintly forbidden. The sacred text that once taught balance between pleasure and virtue had been turned into a manual for acrobatics. And yet almost no one who quoted it, from pop singers to sex therapists, had ever read the original Sanskrit words. The transformation began slowly. When obscenity laws began to loosen in the 1960s and 70s, publishers realized there was gold hidden in the old colonial archives. Burton's translation, once passed hand to hand in secrecy, was suddenly legal and profitable. Publishers repackaged it with lurid covers, often featuring bare bodies posed like sculptures, and titles like The Illustrated Kama Sutra or The Joy of Kama. The text inside was usually abridged, edited, or retranslated entirely, stripped of its poetry and philosophy. Pages of meditative verses about emotional union and aesthetics were replaced with diagrams. The Sanskrit word rati, meaning the art of love, affection, or mutual delight, was flattened into sex position. In this transformation, the Kama Sutra lost not just its nuance, but its soul. A work meant to teach harmony between pleasure, duty, and spirituality had been reduced to a manual of novelty. By the 1970s, the Kama Sutra had become a symbol of something larger, the Western fantasy of the mystical East. To the counterculture generation, India represented freedom from capitalism, from repression, from guilt. Its religions, art, and sensuality were painted as the antidote to Western coldness. But that fascination was rarely rooted in understanding. It was projection. Yoga became a fitness routine. Meditation became a stress relief hack. Tantra became a buzzword for spiritualized sex. And the Kama Sutra, one of India's most refined works on the philosophy of desire, became a commodity of exotic pleasure. It was sold in the same breath as incense and silk cushions, bundled into an aesthetic of spiritual sensuality that comforted the Western gaze without ever challenging it. In glossy magazines and advertisements, the text became a promise that with the right posture, the right partner, and the right brand of enlightenment, one could achieve bliss. But what the Kama Sutra actually taught was far more subtle, that desire is an art, and pleasure, like meditation or music, must be practiced with respect, timing, and awareness. That truth was rarely printed on the packaging. By the time Hollywood discovered the Kama Sutra, its meaning had already dissolved into myth. In films and fashion, Kama Sutra became code for luxury, eroticism, and the exotic. Words that sold easily, but carried little truth. A perfume called Kama Sutra, a restaurant named after it, a film poster showing silk and sweat claiming to reveal the secrets of the East. In reality, what these depictions revealed was not India, but the Western imagination of it, sensual, mysterious, and safely distant. The Kama Sutra was never about conquest or performance. It was about awareness, about knowing one's own nature and one's partner's, about cultivating empathy through touch and timing, about living life fully in both body and mind. But cinema didn't want philosophy, it wanted spectacle, and so the Kama Sutra became an aesthetic, exotic, drapery, slow-motion passion, golden light, stripped of context, history, and spirituality. Walk into a modern yoga studio and you might find quotes from the Kama Sutra painted on walls or printed on tote bags. It's poetic, marketable, and fits perfectly with the Western vision of Eastern wellness. But few realize how far this image has drifted from its roots. In Sanskrit philosophy, karma is one of the purusharthas, the four aims of human life: dharma, virtue; artha, prosperity; kama, desire; and moksha, liberation. The Kama Sutra was never meant to stand alone. It was part of a complete moral framework. It wasn't hedonism, it was harmony. But Western culture rarely translated that part. Instead, karma became code for indulgence, and the sutra became a symbol of flexible bodies and silk sheets. It's a strange irony that a text meant to teach moderation and mindfulness became a symbol of excess. The Kama Sutra's journey through pop culture mirrors Burton's original dilemma: how to present a text about intimacy in a society that misunderstands it. Except now, instead of Victorian shame, the distortion comes from commercial appetite. Modern translations often simplify the text to the art of sex, ignoring that more than half of its verses have nothing to do with intercourse. They discuss grooming, conversation, music, fashion, even architecture, all as aspects of creating a pleasurable, ethical life. In the original, the Kama Sutra was a guide to being human. In the modern version, it's a how-to manual for being desirable. This change may seem small, but it's seismic. When pleasure is separated from ethics, the act becomes hollow, just as when yoga is separated from philosophy or meditation from compassion. The Kama Sutra's modern image, marketed through pop culture, teaches techniques, not meaning. Today, the word karma appears everywhere. There's Kama Ayurveda skincare, Kama Sutra condoms, Kama hotels, Kama lounge. There are tantric retreats in Bali and Kama Sutra workshops in Los Angeles, often led by teachers who've never read a line of Sanskrit. The irony is sharp. A book originally written by a celibate philosopher exploring how desire fits into a moral and spiritual life is now a logo. Its name sells everything from body oil to yoga mats. The spiritual has been rebranded as sensual. The discipline has been replaced by performance, and yet the allure remains, because beneath all the marketing, there's still something magnetic about the idea of pleasure as art, something that whispers of a wisdom we've forgotten. Even in its distortion, the Kama Sutra still calls to people, not for its positions, but for its promise of connection. Perhaps that's why the Kama Sutra endures, because its story, from sacred text to pop symbol, mirrors the story of desire itself, endlessly misunderstood, commercialized, censored, and rediscovered. We live in a world where everything intimate is public, where performance has replaced presence. And in that world, the Kama Sutra has become both victim and participant, a spiritual work forced to live in the age of spectacle. It's quoted on Instagram and sold in airport bookstores, its cover embossed with golden lotus petals, promising ancient secrets of love. But the real secret is that there are no secrets. The Kama Sutra was never about mystery. It was about mindfulness, about knowing that pleasure, like any art, requires care, patience, and attention. It's not about what happens between two bodies. It's about what happens between two souls. And though modern culture has dressed it in sequins and shadows, that core still glows beneath the noise, waiting, quietly, to be read again for what it truly is. Not a catalogue, not a brand, but a philosophy. One that modernity keeps forgetting and rediscovering over and over again, somewhere beneath the layers of misunderstanding, beneath the Victorian censorship, the Western marketing, and the modern gloss. The Kama Sutra still breathes, quietly, patiently, its pulse has never stopped, because at its heart, the Kama Sutra was never about performance. It was about presence. The word karma itself means desire, yes, but not just physical craving. It means the spark of longing that moves all things, the wish to connect, to experience, to be alive. It is the pulse behind art, music, poetry, and devotion, the rhythm of life itself. And Vatsyayana's message was simple. Desire is not to be feared, nor worshipped blindly. It is to be understood. In the original Sanskrit, the Kama Sutra often uses a word that has no perfect translation in English, samvedana, meaning shared awareness or mutual knowing. It describes a state of being fully present, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, with another person. To Vatsyayana, the art of love wasn't about the body alone, it was about consciousness. To love mindfully meant to listen, to sense, to anticipate, to be attentive not only to pleasure but to emotion, silence, and rhythm. Every gesture was a dialogue, every glance a kind of language. Pleasure wasn't an escape from life, it was a way into it. When two people met in desire, they weren't meant to lose themselves, but to find balance within each other. To reach a state where body and soul, action and awareness merged into harmony. It was mindfulness before mindfulness had a name. The Kama Sutra never glorified indulgence, it warned against it. Too much desire, it said, leads to restlessness, too little leads to stagnation. True art lies in moderation, in knowing when to act and when to wait. This idea runs deep through Indian philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of balance between pleasure and duty. The Upanishads describe self-awareness as the root of freedom. Vatsyayana carried that same torch, applying it not to temples or asceticism, but to the home, the heart, the senses, to enjoy without attachment, to love without ownership, to feel deeply without losing oneself. That was the science of desire, the invisible geometry between two beings. In its truest form, the Kama Sutra is a book about respect, not hierarchy, not dominance, respect. Respect for the self, respect for the partner, respect for the act itself as sacred. In one verse, Vatsyayana writes that the highest pleasure arises when both partners feel equal joy. That union, he says, is a meeting of minds as well as bodies. It's a reminder that love is not conquest, it's conversation. Every technique, every ritual described in the text, from how to speak, to how to touch, to how to part gracefully, is rooted in mutual dignity. Because pleasure without respect becomes consumption, but pleasure with respect becomes communion. This is the part modern culture forgets most easily. One of the most beautiful, often overlooked aspects of the Kama Sutra is its attention to stillness, the spaces between action. It teaches that beauty exists in pauses, in anticipation, in the art of waiting. There are entire sections devoted to conversation, to laughter, to music and poetry shared between lovers. To Vatsyayana, these weren't distractions, they were the essence, because love wasn't an event, it was a continuum. Desire, he believed, wasn't meant to be satisfied once and forgotten. It was meant to be cultivated, tended like a fire, never burning too bright to destroy, but glowing just enough to warm. In that way, love was like meditation. Not a goal, but a practice. In Indian cosmology, karma is more than human desire. It is cosmic energy, the creative impulse of the universe itself. In ancient myths, Kama was a god, the one who shot arrows of flowers, awakening the world from stillness into life. His fire wasn't lust, it was vitality. To deny desire entirely was to deny the divine. But to let it rule you was to become enslaved by illusion. The Kama Sutra walked the path in between, the middle road where sensuality and spirituality weren't enemies but mirrors of each other. Each act of love was a small reflection of the larger creation, a reminder that existence itself was born from union of sun and earth, thought and breath, being and awareness. This idea made love sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a universal one. If the Kama Sutra could speak to the modern world, perhaps its first lesson would be this: slow down. In an age of instant gratification, it feels radical to move slowly, to notice, to breathe. But the text was built on slowness, on the belief that true pleasure arises not from intensity, but from attention. To see your partner clearly, to listen to the rhythm of their breath, to touch, not to claim, but to understand. These are small acts, but they create a world of difference. Vatsyayana's lovers were not rushing toward climax. They were learning to dwell in connection, to inhabit the moment so deeply that time dissolved and only awareness remained. That, he believed, was the highest pleasure, the moment when desire and peace become the same thing. Modern society often separates morality and pleasure as if one cancels out the other. But the Kama Sutra united them. It taught that how one seeks pleasure reflects one's character, that selfish desire breeds suffering, while mindful desire brings harmony. It was, in many ways, an early form of psychological insight, understanding that fulfillment is not found in taking, but in tuning. To be ethical in love didn't mean to deny pleasure. It meant to approach it with care, with intention, with empathy. In that sense, the Kama Sutra wasn't only about intimacy between lovers, it was a guide for how to live beautifully in a world full of longing. To be kind in desire, to be conscious in joy, to be awake in love. Perhaps the greatest irony of the Kama Sutra's long journey is that the modern world, so obsessed with connection, has forgotten what connection really means. We chase novelty, not nuance. We perform intimacy without presence. We want to be desired, but not to understand desire. The ancient text, written in a world of slow time and deep reflection, invites us back to ourselves, to our bodies, our senses, our awareness. It asks us to remember that love in all its forms is not something we perform. It's something we practice. And that to live fully, to truly live, is to learn the delicate, lifelong art of balance between pleasure and peace. That is what the Kama Sutra was always about. Not acrobatics, not indulgence, not sin, but mindfulness, the kind that turns every touch, every word, every glance into a small act of reverence. And though the centuries have buried that truth beneath layers of fantasy and misunderstanding, it still glows, quietly, persistently, like an ember waiting to be seen again. The Kama Sutra may have been written nearly 2,000 years ago, but its heart still beats beneath the skin of the modern world. The words of Vatsyayana echo faintly in the chaos of dating apps, relationship podcasts, and quiet moments when someone scrolls through messages searching for meaning. It's strange to think that a text born in candlelight and palm leaves can still speak to a world of touchscreens and swipes. But it does, quietly and insistently. Because at its core, the Kama Sutra was never about positions. It was about presence. And presence is the one thing modern love seems to have misplaced. Our world moves fast. We measure relationships in notifications, affection in emojis, and connection in pixels per second. Desire has become data, a stream of likes, matches, and ghosted conversations. But even here, in this digital storm, the essence of karma, desire as mindful connection, still matters more than ever. When Vatsyayana wrote about touch, he wasn't just describing the physical, he meant awareness, that rare, undivided attention that says, "I see you, I'm here with you." In a world full of distractions, that kind of focus has become the most intimate act of all. If he were alive today, perhaps he'd say, "Put down your phone." Look into someone's eyes long enough to feel the silence between words. That's where Kama still lives. Not in the act, but in the attention. We talk about consent today as a modern moral triumph, and it is. But it's also something ancient India understood deeply. The Kama Sutra was explicit about mutual pleasure. Every act, it insisted, should be willing, reciprocal, and joyful for both partners. It describes gestures of agreement, the reading of emotions, and the importance of patience. In its own poetic language, it said what modern culture is only now rediscovering, that pleasure is ethical when it's shared, that true intimacy cannot exist without respect, without awareness, without equality. The text even warned against coercion and domination, not as moral crimes alone, but as violations of harmony. That idea, that both people should leave a moment feeling whole, not hollow, is timeless. And maybe that's why centuries later the Kama Sutra still feels radical, because in a world that teaches conquest, it teaches connection. One of the most fascinating things about the Kama Sutra is how open it was. Long before the world invented modern labels for gender and sexuality, Vatsyayana described them with calm curiosity. He wrote of men loving men, women loving women, and even those who existed between the two, not as scandal, but as nature. There were no moral judgments, no sermons, just observation. Desire, he seemed to say, takes many forms, and all are worthy of understanding. That kind of inclusivity feels astonishing even now. In many ways, the text was centuries ahead of the world that later tried to censor it. It recognized what we're still learning, that love is not bound by the body, but expressed through it. That connection is a spectrum, not a rule. In this, the Kama Sutra was not ancient, it was timeless. Modern psychology often speaks of emotional intelligence, the ability to understand and respond to the feelings of others. But Vatsyayana was already teaching that. The Kama Sutra devoted entire passages to conversation, humor, patience, and empathy. It taught lovers to read expressions, to comfort sadness, to listen as much as to touch. These weren't just romantic ideals, they were emotional skills. In an age where relationships often collapse under miscommunication, those lessons are more relevant than ever. Imagine if, instead of communication tips, people learned what the Kama Sutra quietly suggested: to notice, to really notice. The curve of someone's laughter, the pause before they speak, the difference between silence and withdrawal. These are the small, invisible gestures that make love last. And they haven't changed in 2,000 years. It's easy to forget that the Kama Sutra has lived many lives. It began as an oral tradition written down in Sanskrit verse. Then it survived centuries of translation, censorship, and reinvention. Today, its fragments are quoted on Instagram, printed in wedding cards and whispered in yoga retreats. But the digital age has done something strange to it. It's made the Kama Sutra both everywhere and misunderstood. It's used to sell perfume, furniture, and even coffee. Its name gets tossed around to mean exotic passion, a brand, not a philosophy. Yet beneath the marketing, something still calls out. That soft insistence that love is not a commodity, that intimacy cannot be mass-produced. Maybe the text endures precisely because it resists simplification. Because even when it's commercialized, its spirit remains intact, a quiet rebellion against our tendency to rush, consume, and forget to feel. If Vatsyayana could see the modern dating landscape and the endless swiping, ghosting, and algorithmic matchmaking, he might smile and then sigh, because the problem isn't that people want too much, it's that they feel too little. The Kama Sutra taught that desire needs depth, context, story, soul. It wasn't about collecting partners, but about cultivating connection. In a digital age, maybe the ancient wisdom is this: don't just pursue bodies, pursue moments. The ones that leave echoes, not just memories. In every hurried text, in every video call across time zones, there's still a flicker of what the Kama Sutra meant. That longing to be understood, to be known fully, to share something more than motion. That's the one hunger technology can't automate. Strangely, as the world speeds up, there's a quiet counter-movement. Mindfulness, slow living, conscious relationships. Ideas that sound modern but are, in truth, ancient. When therapists talk about presence, or coaches preach self-awareness, they echo Vatsyayana's message that love begins in stillness, not strategy. And maybe that's why the Kama Sutra still resonates, because we're slowly remembering that connection isn't about more. It's about meaning. To love someone, or even to live fully, is to bring attention to the ordinary. To sit with another person and be entirely there, even for a few heartbeats. That's what Vatsyayana was teaching, not indulgence, but integration. The union not only of bodies, but of awareness. The wisdom feels almost rebellious now in a world that rewards distraction. But maybe rebellion was always part of the text's DNA. So much has changed, the languages, the cultures, the technology, but one thing hasn't: the human need to connect. The Kama Sutra endures not because it's ancient, but because it's honest. It understood that people, no matter the century, crave the same things: touch, respect, attention, love that feels like being seen. And even now, that truth hums beneath everything we do, in every song, every heartbreak, every attempt to say "I miss you" across a glowing screen. Vatsyayana's voice is faint now, buried beneath centuries of noise, but it's still there. If you listen closely enough, past the static of modern life, you can almost hear him. Whispering that desire was never just about the body. It was about being awake, being alive. There's a quiet truth that runs through every civilization, every century, every story ever told about love. It always finds a way back to us. When we strip away the customs, the languages, the rules, what remains is a pulse, that longing to connect, to be seen, to be felt. The Kama Sutra, more than any scripture or philosophy, recognized that pulse not as something to silence, but to understand. And that understanding, that Kama, is eternal. For much of history, desire has been treated like a wild animal, something to be caged, restrained, or shamed. Religions across the world taught people to conquer it, to fear it, to turn away from its fire. But Vatsyayana's wisdom was radically different. He didn't see desire as an enemy of the soul, he saw it as one of its languages. Kama, he wrote, was not lust. It was the rhythm of being human, the spark that moved art, song, laughter, creativity, and intimacy. Without it, life would become mechanical. Desire to him wasn't corruption, it was color. The Kama Sutra suggested that to live fully meant to understand Kama, not drown in it, not deny it, but learn its melody, to find harmony between Kama, desire, Dharma, virtue, and Artha, prosperity. These were not enemies, but instruments in the same symphony of life. And when played together, they made the soul sing. In our time, love and desire often swing like a pendulum, between guilt and excess, repression and indulgence. One generation hides from desire, another glorifies it. But balance was always the heart of Vatsyayana's teaching. He never said, "give in," he said, "be aware." Know the difference between hunger and connection, between momentary pleasure and lasting joy. between using someone and meeting them. The modern world still hasn't caught up to that nuance. We either chase desire until it empties us, or condemn it until it poisons us. But karma, true karma, asks for neither. It asks for listening. Desire, when listened to, becomes insight. When ignored or forced, it becomes pain. The Kama Sutra wasn't a manual of indulgence. It was a mirror. It asked, what do you really seek when you seek another? That question still cuts through the noise of every app, every fleeting affair, every lonely scroll. Vatsyayana described intimacy as a kind of choreography. Two souls moving together in rhythm, neither leading nor following, but flowing. He compared love to music, delicate, improvisational, sometimes unpredictable. You could learn the notes, but the song only came alive when you felt it. That's why he spent as much time on conversation, trust, and play as he did on physical union, because the dance was never about performance, it was about presence. To touch another being, he said, was to honor them, to see their humanity reflected in yours. And that idea, that sacred equality, was revolutionary. Even now, in a world that speaks of freedom and progress, many still forget it. But every time two people meet with kindness instead of conquest, every time love feels like mutual wonder instead of transaction, the old dance continues. Desire, when misunderstood, burns. But when understood, it illuminates. The Kama Sutra didn't ask us to extinguish our fire. It asked us to tend it, to shape it into warmth instead of flame. That's the difference between passion and greed, between connection and consumption. Vatsyayana understood that pleasure could be sacred, that it could lead not to chaos but to clarity. When two people meet in awareness, they glimpse something beyond the physical, a light that reminds them of their own aliveness. That light, he believed, was a fragment of Brahman, the divine consciousness that pervades all things. So in that moment of shared presence, love becomes more than emotion. It becomes worship, a recognition that the body, the mind, and the soul are not separate instruments but strings of the same harp. Each era rediscovers the Kama Sutra in its own way. Some treat it as a scandal, others as a curiosity, and a few as wisdom. But underneath all the interpretations, the truth doesn't change. Whether whispered in Sanskrit or printed on glossy pages, the message remains. To live is to feel, to love is to listen. Even in the 21st century, with artificial intelligence writing poems and algorithms choosing partners, that truth still breathes. We can digitize desire, but we can't delete it. Because desire isn't a glitch in the system, it's the heartbeat of life. It's in every painting, every song, every late-night confession. It's in the quiet ache of missing someone. It's in the courage to reach out again, despite fear. And so the dance continues. When you study the Kama Sutra deeply, it stops being about others and starts being about you. It asks, what kind of lover are you, not just in bed, but in life? Do you approach others with curiosity or control, with openness or expectation? The Kama Sutra's wisdom applies far beyond romance. It's a guide to being present, to eating, walking, creating, and speaking with awareness. Every act can become an expression of karma if done with care. To listen fully, to taste slowly, to touch gently. That's the art of being alive. Maybe that's why Vatsyayana's work still feels relevant. Because beneath the layers of erotic philosophy, it was a manual for mindfulness. Not the stillness of monks, but the stillness of lovers, the kind that happens when time stops and you simply exist. We've come full circle, from the bustling cities of Pataliputra to the pixel-lit rooms of today, from palm leaves to glowing screens, from myth to modern mind. And yet the longing remains the same, to love, to be loved, to understand. Maybe that's why the Kama Sutra has never really belonged to the past. It keeps evolving, reappearing, reinterpreted by each generation, not as a relic, but as a mirror. When we read it now, what we see is ourselves, our contradictions, our desires, our attempts to find balance between freedom and faith, body and soul. It reminds us that love isn't something to solve, it's something to practice, and that the most profound wisdom is often simple: to meet another heart with kindness, to touch without taking, to love without losing yourself. The Kama Sutra ends not with commandments, but with quiet understanding. It knows that love is a cycle, blooming, fading, returning, transforming. Every beginning carries its ending, every desire carries its lesson, and still we dance. In every century, every culture, every language, people find each other in the same ways, through laughter, through silence, through touch. The Kama Sutra isn't about the dance steps, it's about the music, the rhythm of being human. It tells us that to live is to feel, and to feel is to learn. That the point was never to conquer desire, but to listen to it. Because when we listen, desire stops being hunger. It becomes song. And that song, the song of Kama, is eternal, soft, endless, still playing.